Extreme weather can have a catastrophic impact on businesses to the point where businesses in certain locations can no longer get adequate insurance. Hence, preparation and proactive maintenance are even more critical. We will discuss how climate change events have impacted businesses' reputations, physical assets, people, supply chain, and the importance of examining the full value stream to evaluate your risk exposure. So to get started, Bill Warren, Senior Partner and Forensic Accountant at Sigma 7, discusses the impact of climate change from a financial perspective and the ripple effects this can cause.
So the impact on businesses of climate change is that there's an increasing magnitude and frequency of weather events that are affecting operations, and these increase the risks to people, property, and of course business continuity. And that affects all stakeholders, including employees and their safety, their job security, as well as suppliers and customers and the relationships that you have and whether their organization can survive if they're feeling the ripple effects from a disruption to your operation, as well as, of course, your own management. Your bankers and investors are extremely interested in making sure that you will be a going concern given the known climate change that's coming on the horizon. We don't know what that effect will be, but we can see that there are effects and that they can be severe. As with any change, there will be early adapters and disruptors, and some of their efforts may have high ROI or not, but they are trying to address a situation. On the other end of the spectrum, there will be laggards who demonstrate what not to do, and they will be examples of the lack of resilience to climate change. And of course, in the middle, there will be a spectrum of many organizations trying to do what they can with their limited time and resources to address what's an uncertain future. There is always some level of certainty when we're evaluating risk. However, with climate change, there's a level of uncertainty where we don't fully understand the way it will fully impact magnitude and frequency. And the lack of resilience will show. To a resilient organization, climate change is simply one of many risks, and it doesn't redefine risk management. But it should cause us to be skeptical of our assumptions about the frequency and magnitude about these events that can disrupt our people and our operations. So as we've seen with events that have illustrated the interconnected nature of our economies, from 9/11 in New York to Hurricane Katrina on the Gulf Coast of the US, to the flooding in Taiwan and the earthquake and tsunami in Japan that affected the auto industry, we have seen how the ripple effects can spread geographically, and we're not always fully cognizant of the risks to our suppliers and our customers. These exposures can be much worse than we contemplate for ourselves, and the same is true for climate change. So unless you examine the full value stream, backwards, forwards, sideways, you may understate or simply miss a risk and a threat, and thus you become the ripple effect in another organization's disruption. And/or you can become the ripple effect on a customer or supplier, and that reputational harm, in addition to the direct operational disruption, can have long-lasting consequences on your organization's presence in the marketplace and its reputation. I think we've seen several recent examples of both the increasing frequency and magnitude of climate-influenced losses being worse than they otherwise would be. I think very recently, the repeated windstorm events in Florida with Hurricane Helene followed shortly by Hurricane Milton. I've been helping organizations with windstorm losses since really the last century, the 1990s. I've never been involved in a claim where the debris from the prior claim represented such a threat to this as a second event, because these are occurring in such frequent succession. In fact, with Hurricane Helene, I had never heard the term brown ocean, where the ground was so wet from a preceding event that it exacerbated the follow-on event. So I think that's a clear example of the extremity being made worse as a result of the frequency in addition to the magnitude. The frequency drives the magnitude in a way. And the same is true of hurricanes being spawned by windstorms. Certainly when looking at past claims and the risks of hurricanes, the threat of those has been discussed, but the spawning of tornadoes on the east coast of Florida when the hurricane hit the west coast of Florida, I think was extent of those tornadoes was surprising, and something that also shows how our concepts of the risks and threats posed by climate change need to break us free of any constraints or expectations or boundaries that we have set. We need to think outside of the box. The other areas where we're seeing the effects of climate change on the devastation and the magnitude of loss is certainly in Spain, in the Valencia region, as well as in Connecticut in the United States. They had what was called a rain bomb event, where lack of upkeep of infrastructure can contribute to the damage caused by these slightly stronger or more frequent events. It simply exacerbates the lack of preventative maintenance in addition to the lack of resilience that we're building into our organizations. So it really will differentiate those who plan and approach the risk of climate change versus those who ignore it and wait for the results. So as regards the risk posed by climate change, we would espouse what we would espouse for all risk is simply preparedness. Being ready for, in theory, any event. Ideally, you would evaluate your resilience from a peril agnostic perspective. Whatever the reason for the disruption, whatever the reason for the risk to your people and your property, you will have mitigation options available and at the ready before an event happens. And with climate change, I think it behooves us to be prepared, as the frequency and the unpredictability of these events even reduces our ability to prepare ahead of time. So pre-loss preparedness is always the best practice. As part of preparing, one should identify all of the players and have the financial mechanisms in place to identify and capture the impacts on the organization and to track all of the impacts, both tangible and intangible, as well as upstream and downstream for your customers and suppliers, and being aware of any impacts to them. And as part of that process, we have produced a CAT claim guide that gives an exhaustive preparedness and post-loss response checklist to make sure that you've identified all of the areas of loss and covered the gaps in information that we often find later in the process. So we've prepared this best practice on day one to set your response and recovery off in the best way forward. Whenever there's a loss, it's rarely a success or a good feeling when you're done with the process. However, if you've planned for it and you've responded in kind and minimized the damage and the disruption and the threat to your people, that can very much feel like a success when you've planned and you've implemented your plans and you've come out the other end better than those around you. That also helps with your reputation in the marketplace, and you tend to capture increased market share on the flip side of an otherwise catastrophic event.
Natural catastrophe insurance claims have surged over the past several years, a trend driven by climate change, increasing urbanisation and asset exposure. From 2020 to 2023, insured losses have exceeded $100 billion annually, a first in the industry's history, highlighting the growing financial impact of extreme weather events. With the 2024 hurricane season set to push insured losses beyond $100 billion for a fifth consecutive year, organisations must prioritise resilience and risk mitigation strategies. A resilient business is one that not only responds effectively to crisis but also anticipates future threats, adapting its operations and infrastructure accordingly. Join us tomorrow for our next episode, where we look at the risk of not preparing for climate change and how businesses can prepare from a risk engineering perspective. Want to discover more? Sign up for our webinar with leading industry experts on the 5th of December, where we explore the key natural catastrophes and climate change events of 2024 and what these mean for the evolving risk landscape in 2025. Sign up by clicking the link in this post.